Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to the Fat Muscle Project podcast. I'm John Gorman, one of your hosts. We've got Lisa Franz in the house. Lisa, what's going on? How are you?
I'm very well. I'm excited for today's episode to talk a little bit about reverse dieting.
Yeah, this is something that I've talked about so many times. I've written a book on the topic. We'll talk about that. But no matter how much I've talked about it, and it's the same with you, no matter how much you deal with it with clients or you mention it places, there's always people that need to understand it. There's new people that come in. It's still a complex topic, and I know we're going to do a deep dive here. So if you're listening and you thought you knew everything that you knew about reverse dieting, we've got some extra snippets in here, some stuff that I haven't put out before that we're going to talk about. So it's going to be a fun deep dive. But you've got this whole show lined up. Why don't you go ahead and take the reins?
Yeah, absolutely. It's my pleasure. And just like you say, I think we have even touched on this topic before when we were speaking about hunger, managing hunger, and also the difference between cheat days and refeeds when we had that episode. But as you said, I think there's still a lot of misconception about reverse dieting, and then also people that might be doing their own nutrition, they're still often curious about like, oh, what sort of increase are we really talking about? Is there any advantage of taking it super slow or how fast and so on? So I think this is going to be a very insightful episode. But before we get into the topic, what's your win of the week?
I've got one that relates to this topic, and I want to give Zach Hayward a shout out. He's a client of mine. He came to me a little bit lower calorie because he was trying to diet for a show, so his calories were pretty low, and his body just wasn't responding the way that it should be. So he came to me and he hired me. And what I did right out of the gate, as I said, hey, you're already on low calories. We've got to drop like 25 pounds. Like, I don't have enough room, and that's part of the topic today. I don't have enough room to cut your calories because your body's already got to the point where cortisol's high and it's trying to stall out. He's seeing fat loss resistance, basically. And what I did is I took him for a few weeks and we added food in. We dropped all his cardio. We got his metabolism burning again. And I know there's a lot of people listening. That's not a scientific term, but it's just what we're going to use. We got the metabolism stoked, as all the bros would say, and we got him up and running. And then I could, about 20 weeks out, I could pull calories and create a deficit, and his body actually started to respond. So it's one of those things to where, adding calories in got him there, and he just stepped on stage, the best he's ever looked. He got second place in novice and third in open, and it was a really, really tough class. And he had full abs. He was very shredded. He needs to put on some size, but hey, it's bodybuilding. I don't know very many people that don't need to put on size. So we are now in the reverse dieting process, about 3 to 4 days. So shout out to Zach. Very, very proud of him. And yeah, that's my win for the week.
That's awesome. I like that. I like that it pertains or links up with our topic as well. My win for the week is more of a personal one. I had a nice little weekend getaway, and sometimes it's just good to unplug. And of course, as an entrepreneur or someone with a business, it always requires a little bit of work ahead of time and a little bit more work afterwards, as I'm sure you can relate to and appreciate as well.
Yes.
But it's still good, even just for the sake of looking forward to your own bed again and looking forward to your regular gym again.
Yeah.
It gets you to appreciate what you have on a day-to-day basis even more. So yeah, that was my little win for the week. But yeah, to kick this episode off properly, I would love for you to just give us a bit of history, I guess, if you will, of reverse dieting. And I know that you actually have touched on that before as well in one of the episodes, more so in the sense of like, when did it become popular? When did it actually become a structured thing as opposed to people just like dieting and then stopping to diet or whatever you might want to say. So yeah, if you can kick us off with that.
Yeah, reverse dieting it's the definition of it's dieting in reverse, basically. I don't know who came up with the term. I can say a good friend of mine, Lane Norton, Dr. Joe, those guys were touting it probably earlier before most of us ever were back on the message boards. bodybuilding.com, muscular development message boards, places like that, which are pretty much kind of a ghost town now. There's not really a lot of stuff, but they kind of brought it to the forefront of bodybuilding. And it's dieting in reverse. So in dieting is you drop calories as you go, you try and keep pushing fat loss. And then when you stall, you drop calories, you add cardio, that's dieting. So this is in reverse. So when you're done dieting, whether it's for a competition, you're just trying to lose 20, 30 pounds so you look good in your swimsuit for the summer, or you're just trying to be healthy. After the diet period's over, your calories are going to be lower, right? So now you need to start adding calories back in. You need to start doing things like restoring hormones, because dieting slows hormones down for the most part. We'll do a deep dive on that as well. But it's literally doing the exact opposite. And I think the biggest problem is, and I would definitely say, we don't have an issue with dropping fat. We have an issue with gaining weight back. And when people can reverse diet, it gives you a system to be able to, especially if you're someone who's just trying to look better and you want to diet 20, 30 pounds off, for example, you want to maintain and keep that off. The last thing you want to do after you're dieting down is just go back to eating the way you were and living the lifestyle you were. So basically, this teaches you to control the habits that you had during dieting, slowly, systematically add food in, drop your cardio out, and then you maintain a leaner physique and you get your metabolism repaired and back to a good, healthy place. So when I say repaired, I mean just healthy. And that's literally what reverse dieting is. And I would say I learned more about the processes of this 2008, 9. And then I've actually written, if you're watching on YouTube, you can see it. If you're just listening, it'll be in the show notes. But my very first book I ever wrote was called Metabolic Capacity and Reverse Dieting: How to Prime Your Metabolism for Maximum Fat Loss. And I'll link that in the show notes. You guys can grab it off Amazon. It's like $17 and they will ship it to you the same day. So that's there. And I learned so much as a coach over the years on how to reverse diet people. And there's so many different ways to do it, which we will get into. But it was a bestseller on Amazon, probably for 2 weeks in a row. So I was pretty proud of that. Give that book a shot. Now, there are things in there that we're going to talk about that I've changed my mind on. I've got 2 versions out. Version 2 is the current one, on how much food to add in, how fast to reverse, like the whole 9 yards. I've changed my thoughts on those, but the book outlines that for the most part in version 2. So it's available on Amazon.
Nice. Yeah, and in regards to things changing, as everyone hopefully out there knows, the evidence is constantly evolving, and I think in just actually very recent months or years, people have actually started to question reverse dieting altogether, and is there a purpose of it, and so on. And I think we do need to differentiate between a few things here, and you already did sort of that. Unfortunately, there's only that one term of reverse dieting, and I think there are the two different scenarios. Like at the end of a competition, if you step on stage, sometimes a more aggressive approach with bringing the calories back up is warranted, is needed, and you actually need to gain some body fat back. So if you're taking that a little bit faster, usually people actually refer to that more of a recovery diet. And whereas the reverse diet that we're talking about, or that we can also be talking about, is in general population, as you mentioned, where the aim is to keep fat off. So those 2 things, because often I see on social media where there are 2 different camps, and people say, oh, in a reverse diet you should still be expecting fat gain, and other people that are like, oh no, in a reverse diet and the main aim is to keep the weight and the fat the same, or body fat percentage the same. So we do need to differentiate between, do we actually need to, for health purposes, also bring the body fat back up, as it is the case with competitors, or are you at a place where you're definitely able to maintain that healthy body fat percentage, and yet we need to bring the calories up for metabolism and hormonal health, etc. And because, as you also alluded to, that is what people struggle with. They do a diet and it's successful, and then one of 2 things often happen. Either they go back to the way that they were eating, and then they gain the fat back really quickly. And we see that constant pattern of yo-yo dieting. Horrible, horrible, horrible. And for many reasons that you will probably touch on later on, your body, you will probably gain more and more fat every single time. For no reason. Like, it's a terrible cycle to be in. But then the other scenario is where people are so afraid of eating more again, because they're like, oh, I've been at the lowest weight that I've ever been at now. I don't want to eat more, because how can I eat more and still stay the same? And then they just keep the calories low, and then that becomes their new maintenance. And then we're also in a horrible cycle, because then from there they might want to lose more weight, and so then they have to drop it lower and lower and lower, and at some point you're at like 1,000 calories, and where do you go from there? That's not healthy, and that's not sustainable either. So yeah, I'm sometimes a bit sad that we only have that one term of reverse dieting that applies to competitors as well as Gen Pop, as well, like in those senses. But yes, also just, I guess what I'm trying to say is just know that there's also the term of recovery diet, when we are taking a much more aggressive approach with bringing the calories back up, and we're very conscious of the fact that we need to get body fat back up there, and reasonably quickly as well.
It's something I'm glad you pointed out the two different scenarios, because there's one more thing I want to throw in for our listeners that I want you to make sure you stay tuned on this. So there's also a place for Gen Pop where you diet down, you diet that 20, 30 pounds off. Now you're where you want to be. You do need to get your calories back up, because you don't need to, if you're a female, you don't need to leave your calories at 1,200 to try and maintain your new 130-pound body weight. Here's the thing. Sometimes I might have a female down to 160 pounds at the end of her diet. She dropped from 200 to 160, and her calories are gotten pretty low, and it's time to reverse. Or maybe it's a guy, I've dropped him from 300 pounds down to 240, but both people still need to drop some weight, but they need to reverse diet because I've gotten their calories low, and it's gotten to the point where they're starting to eat off the plan, and it's just too hard to stick to, right? So then it's time to reverse. Here's the thing. There is a way to reverse and add calories in and still continue to drop body fat. And I'm going to talk about that. I've had lectures on this all over the nation, actually, at different conferences. I call it the unicorn approach to dieting, how to add calories in and keep dropping weight. And I'll give a couple of really good scenarios. So we will talk about that one. It's not the most common. So I guess I could start with the bodybuilding approach, since that's the least common that we're going to see people with. And that, to me, is definitely the recovery diet. And that's when anytime a male or female diets to get on stage, your body fat gets so low, it's definitely going to impact your hormones. It's going to impact testosterone. Cortisol is going to be very chronically high. Your metabolism is going to be slower, because your bodies are not made to operate at that body fat level. Listen, this is why when you see someone compete on stage, you don't see them walking around stage lean year round, because it's not healthy. Women, your hair is falling out. You don't have a cycle, or you have a cycle every 10 days. Like, it really throws things out of whack, right? Guys, it's the same thing. Low libido, low sex drive, low motivation. It's all low testosterone related. And you can't gain muscle that way. So the thing is, you've got to get body fat back up, and that's a recovery diet. So the idea of putting body fat on, that scares people, but for those people that are dieting to get on stage, it's very important. So I like to reverse people pretty fast. I like to get, for most women, 5 to 10 pounds on them pretty quickly, probably in the first month and a half. The thing is, you don't want to add a bunch super fast. You don't want to add it in 2 or 3 weeks, because one, mentally, no one wants to feel like that. You just looked your best. Let's get some on, but let's not put 10 pounds on in 3 weeks. Like, you're going to be heavy. You're not going to look good. You're going to look bloated, and you're just not going to. And the thing is, after a diet is over to get on stage, you also have to put on lost muscle, and that's a part of the process. So a lot of people are like, oh, just go eat like crazy and put this weight on in 2 or 3 weeks just to hurry up and get your hormones back. There's also a component that it takes time to get your hormones back. It's not about how fast you can put fat back on. It's how much time you're away from the diet as well. So you need to add fat. You need to add back lost muscle that came from dieting for a competition. So I like to systematically do it. And you need to slow the fat gain. After about 8 weeks, it needs to slowly trickle up. You don't need to keep adding too fast, because after you diet for a show, you can put fat on very, very
Oh
rapidly.
yes.
I mean, very rapidly. And then people freak out and they try and turn around and diet it off, but it's not going to come off because your test is low, your cortisol is still high, and your metabolism's still low. So that's where you get into this really bad place where you yo-yo after a show, and that's terrible, terrible. So yes, the recovery diet's important. I'm sure we'll talk about that in detail, how much to add, unless you want me to talk about it now from the bodybuilding standpoint.
The only other thing I was going to throw in, because you mentioned your body will put on fat, or will be inclined to put on fat very quickly. I was going to recommend another book to the listeners, which is called Fat Loss Forever by, as you mentioned, your friend Emily Norton, I think is one of the authors. I can't remember the other author, but he basically explains really beautifully the three-pronged system that our body uses to prevent fat loss in general. Because I mean, we have to remember, essentially our body doesn't want us to be losing fat. It wants us to be staying at, you know, the current thing that it's used to. It wants to prevent us from starvation. And so of course the first one is, as we're dieting, that over time the metabolism adapts to our intake, our lower intake, and then just slows down you know, basically our need or energy expenditure, etc. So that's one point. And then the second point that he's making in that book as well is that post diet, as you were saying, hunger signals are going to be increased. Everything in your body is basically telling your body, hey, you should be storing anything that's coming in extra, or from, like, in addition to what we were used to over these last few weeks. You might want to think about storing this as fat, because perhaps she's going back into another weight loss phase, or another, you know, hunger, whatever. And so we're gonna not use that for energy, and instead we're just more inclined to store that. So all your instincts, your you know, your leptin, your ghrelin, everything is just not in order, not where it should be. So I always say to people, especially like Gen Pop, post diet is like the phase where we still need to be most diligent. And unfortunately, that's where most people stop being diligent, because they have that feeling of like, oh, I've reached my goal, I can relax now. And often, or sometimes they even cancel coaching because they're like, oh yeah, and I think we spoke about this before, but they think, yeah, I've reached my goal, I'm good to go out on my own now. And then you have to explain, no, 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 you know,
Yeah.
give it another 3 months. And if in 3 months you're still at where you want to be, then I'm very pleased or content letting you go out on your own. But we need to be like super diligent now over these next whatever 2 months, just to make sure you're not actually like, this would be the worst time to be intuitively eating
Yeah.
by far.
Yeah, it's something to where you know, especially from the Gen Pop side, if we're going to switch over to that a little bit, um, especially if you need to keep dropping weight, that is something. So like I said, the guy that drops from 300 to 240, or maybe the female that drops from 200 to 160, the more strict you are when you go to add calories in, and we'll talk about how much to add and how to do it, the more strict you are. I tell my clients this all the time. Your metabolism speeds up when you start adding food back in, as long as you're strict, right? So for example, I might have a female 1,200 calories towards the end, her body's starting to stall out, she's starting to eat off plan, because listen, that's normal. You get to where you're dieting so long and you're hungry and your calories are low, you just want to eat something. So I mean, people start to eat off plan. We all do, let's just face it. If you're dieting for a show, that's not part of the equation. You can't cheat on the diet. But if you're someone who's dieting for health, you're at some point you're going to eat a burger, you're going to eat something, a kid's birthday, whatever. At that point, it's all right, let's take a break from dieting, and you start to systematically add calories in. And maybe I add 20 carbs a day, and I get my female athlete or client up from 1,200 to 1,280. And maybe her high carb day is like 1,500 at that point, right? And I tell her, I say, hey, listen, be very, very strict. There's still a really good chance that you're going to continue to drop weight, because what's happening is now, as you add food in, and I completely pull cardio out, by the way, whatever cardio people are doing, I pull it all out, and all I have them do is weight train. And what's that do? That gives their body a break from the chronically high cortisol. So when cortisol is super high, and we've talked about this in prior episodes, when cortisol is chronically high, It slows down your metabolism. You make less total T3 usually. Your testosterone's going to be lower. All these things are happening. So now when you pull the cardio out, it gives your body a break and cortisol starts to come down. So now you start making more T3, which is a snapshot of your metabolism. You start making more testosterone. Your hormones start to come back up. Then as you add food, you're starting to recover better. Your metabolism's speeding up because you're adding food. And what do I see happen? I see people keep dropping weight week to week as long as they're nailing the reverse. And a lot of people say, oh, you should never reverse someone that slow. Remember the scenario. If they still are obese and they still need to continue to drop weight, you can do a slow reverse. You're still helping getting them healthy, but it's also important to remember they still got weight to drop. So I want to get that female, she might drop another 10 pounds just on the reverse. So we might spend 3 months reversing. Maybe I get her up to 1,800 calories and she maintains that for a while. And now instead of 160, she's 150. Now in 3 or 4 months, I can turn around and I can lower the calories again, and we can make another push for 2 months, and we can get another 15 pounds off of her. And now we're there. Then you start the reverse process. So I did this most notably with, he's one of our fat muscle coaches. His name is Jason Wells. If you go to my Instagram page, you'll see he's pinned up at the top. He went from 454 pounds down to 196. But this was all done in stages. And I remember the first stage of dieting we did, he dropped, and I can't remember at this point because we've dieted so much and we've done so much together. I think he dropped 150 pounds. I got his calories down to lower 2000s, and he still needed to drop, probably 100 pounds. So we reverse dieted up, and he dropped another 35 or 40 pounds on the reverse because the guy stuck to it like to a T. And then we turned around, we dropped his calories again after 3 or 4 months, and he went and dropped the rest of the weight. So it's one of those things, like I said, I call it the unicorn approach to dieting. It's really just working with how the body works, but it's nothing magical that a coach is doing. To me, coaches get too much credit. It's the client sticking to the plan. That's the whole thing that makes that key. Now, I will say there are people that I have reversed, and they've told me that they've tracked their numbers and they're very strict and they don't continue to drop. And that's when someone has some pretty hardcore weight loss resistance. Maybe they've got a history of yo-yo dieting, things like Weight Watchers, and just low calorie, off and on gain, regain weight, for 5, 10 years, maybe even longer. And typically it's females I have the hardest time with because they're most susceptible to hormones being off from yo-yo dieting. Guys are a little bit more resilient. They're a little bit easier to work with because our hormones just aren't as fragile. So there are some people it's just not going to work. But if I had to put a number on it, I'd say 7 out of 10 people that I reverse and they still need to drop weight, I can get some more weight off of them as they add calories. So that's the skinny on the unicorn approach.
That is awesome. And yeah, I love it always when that happens. And because people are just so surprised by it. As I was saying, I think most people are afraid of adding in more food. So maybe you can point out and I know you already did, but just again, like summarizing the mechanisms behind why that works, or like not necessarily the drop in weight, but mainly the main mechanisms behind why don't we put on weight as we increase food normally.
Well, most of it is going to be tied to cortisol and the metabolism. But so let me tell people the thing with everyone's metabolism slows when you diet because that's how the body works. And here's why. If I dieted a guy from 300 to 240, as he gets lower in body weight, and as you do lose some muscle with dieting, especially towards the end, the longer you diet, the more at risk you are for muscle loss, right? So towards the end, as you lose muscle, your metabolism has to speed down. Your body temperature has to slow down because as you lose weight and as you are lighter and as you lose a little bit of muscle, if your metabolism doesn't slow down, your body temperature would actually rise, if that makes sense. And there's no way your body will never let that happen. So as you get lighter, less muscle, your metabolism has to naturally slow and it adapts to the current calories you're on. And that's where people see fat loss stalls. It's really metabolic adaptation, and you adapt on the way down, but you can also adapt on the way up. So that's normal. Stalls are normal in dieting. You take away some food, you add some cardio, and you continue to, because now if a female is dieting and she's eating 1,300 and she stalls, I might drop her to 1,200. That will get, some more weight off of her, right? But that's normal. Then her body will adapt and stall somewhere at that 1,200 mark, more than likely. Now, on the way back up, the opposite happens. So your metabolism starts to adapt to adding calories back in. Like I said, your cortisol goes down and your metabolism speeds up from less cortisol, but also from adding the foods because it adapts on the way back up. And that's where I see the body just getting to a healthier state and you continue to drop body fat. And that's the mechanism behind it. And that's the other thing I know I want to bring up stalls. They're just very, very common. And the harder you diet, the more extreme the diet, the more hard the stalls are going to be towards the end. So like, for regular dieting, for someone like me or the other people I use as an example, stalls aren't going to be as hard as someone dieting for a show and I've got to get that last 5 pounds off of them and they have no body fat on their ass cheeks, for example. Like my guy from the UK, Liam, who's on his way to stay with me this week and do IPE Worlds. I've posted videos of him. The guy is as lean as any bodybuilder has ever been. It's just the way it is. They call him the shredder. And to get those last few pounds off, like it takes a lot. And there are stalls in there. There are things that happen. In bodybuilding, that's common. But I can't remember where I was going with that. That's the mechanism with stalls, and then the opposite happens on the way back up.
I think that's explained very nicely, and you basically summarized it quite well just by saying it pertains to metabolic adaptation and the reverse being the case as you reverse diet. And I think again, like metabolic adaptation, or your metabolism in general is comprised of several things that are affected by your food intake. So for instance, well, we have a thermic effect of food. As you consume less food, obviously you're burning less calories by process or by basically getting that food into your system. Number two, your NEAT usually slows down, even if people are mindful of their steps. Still their gesturing, whatever, their energy output is just going to go down. They're probably not going to expand as much energy in the gym either. And then so like even your basal metabolic rate, as you mentioned, with hormones, etc., is affected by consuming less. And the same is the case as we're bringing those calories back up. Your NEAT is gonna pick up again. You might just feel like you have a lot more energy. I often refer to it as when you're dieting, you might feel like a laptop that's not plugged in. It's still usually, at least in the beginning, doing what it's kind of supposed to, and it's working quite well. The lower the battery gets, the more power saving notifications you start getting. But then when you plug that back in and you give your body not just what it needs, but maybe even like a little bit more than what it actually requires, it's going to start running all these backup processes. It's going to start like actually working on all these things optimally. And the same is the case with your body. As you mentioned, like your hair might grow faster, like random things like that. Hair grows faster, nicer skin, nicer nails, all these things that require energy by the body. So that's where that whole energy goes, and how we can possibly continue to increase food but keeping the body weight maybe the same, or even it dropping it lower even. But yeah, you also already mentioned a little bit about the rate at which you sometimes like to increase versus, sometimes slower, sometimes faster. If someone's trying to do their own reverse diet, do you have a bit of a guideline, or even for yourself, like competitor versus Gen Pop, how fast do you go in terms of an increase? How much do you increase it by, and what do you increase it from? Carbs, protein, fats?
So typically I'll talk about two things. So someone dieting for show and then Gen Pop. This is also predicated on one very big point, because you're going to see everyone out there on social, people on podcasts saying that doing a slow reverse is the stupidest thing ever. But let me throw this one caveat out there. There are times I will only add 15 to 20 carbs to someone's plan that week. So a female might be eating 120 carbs. I might move her up to an extra 15 carbs, 20 carbs. And that is if that person, guy or girl, doesn't matter, is cheating on the diet and they're spending 2 or 3 days where they can't stick to the plan and they're eating extra calories anyway. So the last thing I want to do is add 200 to 300 calories and they're still cheating on the diet 3 days a week. That's a recipe for massive fat gain. So cheating on the diet and having issues with food after a diet is a very common thing. Don't be ashamed of it if that's you listening. Every time I diet, I have an issue with food after. I'm not binge eating, but I have the fuckets where I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to eat extra. Well, I probably don't need to add calories to my daily plan if I'm eating extra a couple days a week, right? So this is all predicated on how strict you are going to be. The more strict someone, the faster you can raise their food. Gen Pop or someone dieting for a show. So um, I like to add at least three, four, 500 calories to a competitor's plan. Female usually closer to 300 out of the gate. Guys typically closer to 500, just because it's all, they're guys are larger, they have more muscle mass. So I might take a female from 1200 straight up to 1500. And you got to remember, we're also throwing in a free meal once a week because people need to be normal or they're having a higher carb day, right? So you don't need to add a ton, but you need to add, there's also a carb up day, a high calorie day. And then for Gen Pop, generally, if I still have to keep dropping weight off of them, excuse me, I will add 20 carbs on average to most people, 20 to 25 carbs. Um, if there's a free meal in there, that's definitely doable. Most people are having a high carb day, and I leave those pretty high so they can enjoy food once a week. But that's about what I like to do. But the other thing you have to remember, I drop cardio out completely. So if someone getting on stage is doing an hour of cardio a day, maybe they were burning, I don't know how many calories that's going to burn, 100, 150 maybe, walking. Um, Now all of a sudden you've got those extra 150 calories that your body is not burning. So that it's similar to adding food because you're not doing the cardio. It's your body doesn't have to recover from it. So you've got to remember you're dropping cardio out, but you're adding food back in. So like I said, it's hard to give someone a guideline. The book does have recommendations, but I think a safe bet is add 20 carbs, watch it for a week. If you're not eating off the plan, add another 20 carbs the next week. And this is for Gen Pop. And watch your weight. And if you're not gaining, add another 20 carbs the next week. Here's the thing, if you add 20 carbs 3-4 weeks in a row, that's an extra 60 to 80 carbs a day. You're probably getting pretty good to the point to where you don't have to add a lot. So if you're a female and you ended your diet, Gen Pop, at 120 carbs, you add 20 3 weeks in a row, now you're up to 180 carbs. There's not a lot of females that in the Gen Pop world that need to eat more than 180 carbs a day or 200 carbs a day. That is definitely plenty to maintain on. You start getting above that and you have a high calorie day or free meal week, and then you're going to start looking at unwanted fat gain. So that's the thing. I like to kind of sit around the 20 carb mark for most females. Guys, 25, 30 carbs, and just go from there. Now, on the bodybuilding side of things, like I said, I like to add quite a bit faster. And I'll usually have them do a couple high days a week as well. So not only am I adding food, maybe it's 30 carbs a week, I'm also adding, 2 high days a week on their weaker body parts to help those grow. So they're eating more food in general, more. So yeah, that's kind of the guideline I would give. But the thing is, you got to watch and you've got to be self-aware of. I mean, a lot of stuff off the plan. I probably don't need to add a lot of food this week.
No, I think that's a really, really good pointer, especially also with the being honest with yourself and with your coach ideally too about the meals eaten off track. But yeah, I would absolutely agree with that in terms of coaching practice. I would say anywhere from 5 to 15% of their calories added back in, as you mentioned, for most people that's going to be like somewhere in the 10% range with that first increase. But as you mentioned, if you want to go a bit faster with competitors, etc., that's certainly going to be above that likely. But for Gen Pop, I would say that we usually somewhere around like 10-15% sort of thing. And because you mostly mentioned carbs as well, I think if sometimes at the very end of the diet, fats are super, super low, I like to go with a combination of both. Or, if someone generally tells me they're not as much of a carb person, they prefer to have more salmon, avocado, and nuts and whatever, then I am also not averse to mostly increasing through fats. So it's really, for Gen Pop, up to personal preference a little bit as well. But generally speaking, I'm totally agreeing with what you're saying. So you mentioned mostly every week, sometimes every 2 weeks. It depends kind of on the situation, how often you would increase. Now, a question I often get from people that are not coaching or just generally curious about doing their own reverse would be, when do I know that I'm done? Because of course, well, number one, we know or likely know that your maintenance after the diet is not going to be the same as before the diet, likely not for the competitor, and definitely not for the Gen Pop person that has dropped whatever, ever 30, 40 pounds or whatever. But let's just say if you have dropped, so like someone who's just wanting to jump back to their previous maintenance, I always advise against that, because again, as we talked about, if you lose fat mass, then later on you have less body to carry around, so therefore your maintenance is going to be lower. So yeah, how does someone know / figure out when they're actually done?
So I'm going to give someone kind of a cheat sheet, a number to how to just get a general range of where your calories should end up. And we can talk about macro distribution if you want, but just general calories probably to save time. If you take your, now I'm talking about Gen Pop here. If you take your goal weight, and we'll talk about bodybuilding in a minute. So females and males, Gen Pop listening, you take your goal weight and take that times 13 to 15. All right. And I just grabbed my calculator here. If you're watching on YouTube, you saw me doing a bunch of stuff. If a female's goal weight is 140, you take that times 13, that's 1,820 calories. That is a general loose number that you can work your way back up to, and you should be somewhere pretty good. I don't know a lot of Gen Pop women that need to be a lot higher than 1,800 calories. Now, remember, you're going to have a day that you're going to have a free meal, or you're going to have a high carb day. So, right, if you're not having those during the week, which is hardly anybody, if you're trying to just get your calories as high as possible and not have a free meal or a high carb day, sure, you can get these up to 2,000 calories. But that high carb day means your other days need to be a little bit lower. So a female at 140, that's her goal weight, ultimately about 1,820 calories. A guy, maybe your goal weight is 200 pounds. Times 13 is about 2,600 calories. Okay. Now take that times 12 to 15. And that's the other thing. You just have to, you got to give it a guess, right? But start on the lower end. And if you get to 2,600 calories and you're a guy, keep working up. As long as you're not gaining, you're fine. I tell people this in emails all the time. I say, hey, listen, when I add their food, I tell them, because, as you said, some people are scared of gaining weight back. So when I add their 20 carbs or 25 or 30 carbs, whatever it is, I say, hey, listen, your calories are not enough to gain fat on. Gaining fat is going to come from eating off the plan. It's going to come from eating over these calories. So these calories, you're never going to gain fat. A female that's training hard 4 or 5 days a week, she's not going to gain fat on 1,800 calories if she's worked her way up there. It's the extra stuff that's added. Same thing with a guy. You're not going to, if you're 200 pounds eating 2,600 calories and you're working out hard, you're not going to gain fat on that. It's the free meal. It's the extra stuff. It's the stuff not being counted. So with that being said, that's a general rule of thumb that I like to use. Obviously, there are outliers. There are people that have very slow metabolisms. They're very genetically non-gifted. And then we have the genetically gifted. They can eat everything in sight and still have six-pack abs. We're not talking about those outliers, okay? We're talking about, 99% of the population.
Yeah, I think that's really well put. Sorry, you wanted to add
Bodybuilding.
something?
Sorry, people that are doing a show, how do they know when they're done reverse dieting? So and I'm talking about mostly natural athletes here. I'm not talking about the assisted side. Maybe at some point we'll do a podcast on that, but here, most people listening are not assisted, and there might be some people on TRT, and that's fine. But for most people, natural. When you're done doing a show, there's a couple different ways you're done. One, you need to get labs done about 4 months after a show. Make sure your testosterone is back to normal. Make sure your T3 is a 3.0 or higher. That's a healthy metabolism, and your TSH is 2.0 or lower. Go back and listen to myself and Allison Fehrenbach. We did a breakdown of labs. I believe it's episode 16. Go back and listen to that one. But you need to get your labs done 4 months post-show and make sure everything is in a healthy spot. All right. We talk about that on that episode. And then finally, guys, I don't like to see most natural guys above 25 pounds up from their stage weight when they did a show. So if you were shredded, you can get up 20, 25 pounds being a natural guy. You start getting up 40, 50, 60 pounds, unless you're just this gigantic guy, which those are outliers. I'm not talking about those. 25 pounds, that's about the tip of the iceberg. So then you're done. So you want to work your calories up, but also if your weight ends up around 20, 25 pounds over stage, that's fine. Women, for the most women that are going to compete, I like to see their stage weight anywhere from 10 to 20 pounds over. Larger women, maybe you get up to 20 pounds. Maybe if you're, I've dieted some women that are 150 pounds on stage, so maybe they're off season and they're 170. That sounds crazy for some people, but they look good at 170. They're probably 6 foot tall. Okay. But some women that are 105 pounds on stage, you could probably walk around at 115, 120, because we still need to diet 15 pounds off you. That's still a 15 to 20 week prep. So it doesn't sound like a lot, but for people that don't have a lot of muscle mass, you don't need to be that high. And going back to my client that I talked about in the very beginning of this, he just stepped on stage. He was 145 pounds, Zach Hayward, and he did well. But I told him in his email on Monday, I said, hey, Zach, you're not a large individual. We don't need to jump your stage weight way up. You don't need to get way up to 180 pounds. Like, we need to stay about 15 to 20 pounds over. So 15 pounds over 145 is 160. If you get up to 20, you're at 165. That's a 20-week prep. I was like, we don't need to get heavier than that. And I explain that to people. It all depends on where your stage weight was and, kind of getting up from there. You don't want to gain too much. So that's how you're done if you've stepped on stage.
I really like that you have this more moderate approach, because especially looking from the outside into the bodybuilding world, it often seems like people fluctuate hugely. Like, you will sometimes see, I don't know, like just these tiny little girls ballooning in their off seasons, and I obviously the same with guys. And I'm just thinking, I mean, yes, of course we need to get to a healthy place, but that huge fluctuation can also not be healthy body image wise or in any kind of other way, really. So I like that you have a much more moderate approach there. And in terms of what you mentioned with Gen Pop, what I would just add there is hunger is a really, really bad gauge of when you're actually at maintenance, as we were alluding to earlier. And because oftentimes people are like, oh, I'm still hungry. Or on the other end of the spectrum, when it's about increasing food and they're afraid of it, oftentimes you'll hear, but I'm not hungry at all. I don't want to eat more. And we spoke about the hunger in a different episode, but then that's also just a sign that your metabolism really is compromised at this stage, and you cannot rely on your hunger signals at that point. So I wouldn't go by hunger. As you mentioned, having a rough idea of where your new maintenance is at, and especially if you potentially even have a body fat percentage, you can find some really great, reasonably accurate calculations out there, whether that even allows you to plug in your body fat percentage and gives you much more accurate estimation of your maintenance than just height, age, weight, whatever. But generally speaking, you also mentioned sometimes, once you might see the weekly average weight go up, and I'm specifically talking about weekly average because we all know day-to-day fluctuations tend to be misleading, particularly for us women. Like, don't freak out if a few days you have a higher scale weight, especially if it's like just after an increase in carbs and you're like, oh my God, the scale is up like a pound or a pound and a half. I'm like, okay, well, carbs, as we know, bind to water in the body. So even just because of that, it can take some time for your body to get used to, or you might be more constipated because you're eating more food and your body's not used to it anymore. So give it some time, right? So we really need to look at the weekly average, if not a little bit more than just the day-to-day trends. But if you can see that weekly average going up, then you might want to hold back with the next increase, and maybe your weight will stabilize again. Or maybe if it keeps going up, then you've just gone a teeny tiny bit too far, so pull back, and that's it. No need to panic or anything like that. So that would be what I would add to that. And I think some of the other things that I'm noted down here, you've actually already touched on. I wanted us to go into how much fat gain to expect, if any, and we made sure to differentiate here between the competitors and non-competitors. And then also we touched a little bit on mindset when it comes to going into a reverse diet for people, whether that's Gen Pop. And I would hope that a competitor, and I think you actually mentioned that before you even take on a client who wants to step on stage, etc., you have clear communication with them that it's not sustainable to walk around at whatever body fat they end up with on stage. And so they should know, okay, I need to gain weight back. And while knowing that and actually doing it is two different pairs of shoes, but still at least they have the right expectation. And at the same time, you can still, I think, by walking them through it slowly, you can take a lot of fear away, as opposed to just giving them 500 calories on top of whatever they were eating. So
Exactly.
pace definitely is a big one, especially for women. And also if they have the confirmation, like, okay, I added 20 grams of carbs, I'm not suddenly 5 pounds heavier just from that. So it really often helps to just take it slow, talk them through it, make sure that you're like always there for them as a coach to be approachable when it comes to questions. And no question or no concern during that stage is silly, because it's totally natural to have those fears. You've worked so hard to get that weight off, so obviously you don't just want to gain it all back, especially if that's, historically speaking, your experience from, like, you lost weight and it's coming back, and you lost weight, it's coming back. So of course it's not only natural that fear is within you. That's what I wanted to add on that. Do you have anything else to add in terms of mindset tips when going into a reverse diet?
Yep, I just pulled out my notebook and was looking. The last time I spoke about what I'm going to say right now was in one of my lectures last year, and I knew it, and I knew there was something I almost forgot. So here's something I want everyone to understand, and that's your metabolism and a way to keep it slow as you reverse in the off season. So here's the situation we want to avoid. And I used to do this with myself and clients. We would keep our calories and our carbs low through the week so we could have these massive days on Sunday where we could just eat as much as we wanted. And here's the thing. Protein was high during the week, right? Listen, we're all bunch of bodybuilder bros, right? So we keep our carbs lower, right? Not like keto, but we would keep them low. Protein's high, fat was okay, excuse me. And then we would stay depleted. That way on Sunday, we would just eat all day long. And let me tell you, it was a blast. We would make pancakes, we would eat Pop-Tarts, we'd eat cereal, we'd eat low-fat ice cream every day, like you go Sunday night, and it was just fun, right? And I built this giant team that was doing that for a long time. And here's the downside to that. And I wish there was some way we could study this, but it'll never happen. So here's my thoughts on what's happening. If you do that in the off season, imagine Monday through Saturday, you're staying lower calorie. Like I might have been eating 2,000 calories, so I could eat 5,000 on Sunday. Well, your metabolism has adapted to those 6 days of only 2,000 calories. Women, maybe you were only eating 13, 1,400 for 6 days, so you could eat 3 or 4,000. The problem is now your metabolism has adapted to those 6 days. So what do you think is going to happen on that final day you eat all that food? Your metabolism's slower because it's adapted, so that food sticks to you easier. So now you're quote unquote in the off season, or in your weight is still going up because you're gaining weight every Sunday. But you're not eating enough to lose fat for the next 6 days. You're keeping it low, right? Because your metabolism adapted. That's the number one thing we want to avoid, like the plague. And here's why I changed over to not doing these massive refeeds anymore. I like to eat calories as high as I can Monday through Saturday for those 6 days. And then when you do have a free meal on Sunday, your metabolism is such a healthy place. Sure, you're going to put on a pound or two from salt and the extra carbs and stuff like that, right? But you're going to drop that 2 to 3 days later, and your weight's going to stay the same because your metabolism's healthy and it helps you burn right through that. So that's the thing. The higher you can get your calories during the week, you don't need to have these giant, massive shit fests, is what they were. But it also means you're not going to gain fat as easy. So just remember, the lower you try and keep your calories to offset, so you can have those big free days or free meals or all that stuff, the easier it is to gain fat on those. But you're not doing yourself any justice through the week.
I
because you're
love that you mentioned that. Yeah, from a metabolic perspective, but also just from I think from a food relationship perspective as well, because obviously it's so much you know you're gonna perform much better in your day-to-day life, in your training, in your work, and whatever if you have those whatever 2,000 calories as opposed to 1,300, and you're not going to feel as shit the day after your massive treat day there.
right.
As so like I think I mean we've spoken about refeeds and how they can be great, and having higher calorie days and free meals is awesome. But as you mentioned, like really keeping it to moderation. So I love that. The last point that I noted was simply if you had any highlights of reverse dieting clients, but you actually opened with that with the client that's coming to visit you, I believe. Or do you have any other? Well, I guess you had some other examples as well of clients that continue to drop weight as you were reversing them.
Yeah, there's a couple things I want to point out, and then I think that's pretty much everything on my end. One, I want to talk about if you stay too lean after you reverse diet, you do a show, you can stay super strict and keep your body fat very low. I did that with a couple clients back when I very first started doing this because I didn't know and we weren't looking at labs. And I kept someone about 5 pounds over stage, and he looked amazing. Test levels came back 5 months later. 20 weeks later, test levels should have been normal. He should have been good. They were low because his body fat was too low. So
Mm-hmm.
that's something I just want to make sure I reiterate. After a show, you've got to get your body fat back up because I've seen people stay too lean and get their calories. It has nothing to do with calories. His hunger was still through the roof because his leptin was low. His hunger signal was not getting to his brain saying he's full because his body fat was too low, but his testosterone stayed very low. And that's not what we want. That's not bodybuilding. Bodybuilding is about being healthy. And then finally, one other bodybuilding example, and I've done this. My goal with every single client, if possible, is to have them ready for stage a month out. Liam McKeon, who is coming to stay with me, the guy from the UK, shredded. What we did was once he got 100% stage lean, we started adding food into the show, and I would add. He was eating 300 carbs to diet on. We got him up to 350 and then up to 400, and he's maintained his condition because he's stayed super, super strict. So for people out there doing a show, if you are stage lean early, the two things you want to do is pull your cardio out 100% because cardio is there to burn body fat. And if you're shredded, you don't have a lot of body fat. So guess what the cardio is going to do? It's going to tap into muscle. All right. So when you're very lean, muscle loss happens very quickly. Pull your cardio out. You're not going to gain fat. You're actually going to look better because cortisol is going to drop. But start adding 20 carbs a week in. You're not going to gain fat from that. Your physique's going to pop, your cortisol is going to drop, and you just will look more quote unquote anabolic, right? You're going to be fuller, you're going to be more vascular. You just keep adding the carbs in, and you come in with a metabolism that's good, and your body's not so beat down. So it's coming in fresh, and you don't have to do a bunch of crazy stuff to peak after that. By the way, you're already adding food in. You just continue to ride that train all the way in, and that's what we've done with Liam. We're going to carb him up on like 600 carbs a day before the show because he's eating 350 to 400. We don't have to do a lot. We've been testing it. So that's one thing I want to point out. If you're ready early, add some food back in every week. 20 carbs is perfect. Drop your cardio out, and you're going to look better.
That's awesome. I think a really good last point for people of eating into a show. And yeah, so hopefully everyone enjoyed this reverse dieting episode. Our next episode is going to be, or our next full length episode, not the question of the week, but full length episode is going to be on advanced supplementation. So stay tuned for that. And that's all that I've got for us.
Yeah. If you're listening, please hit pause, go in, leave us reviews. We're almost to 50. Once we get to 50, we're going to give away a $250 gift card for Fat Muscle Project supplements, anything you want on the site. So go ahead and go in and leave us a review. We appreciate that. For myself and Lisa, we're out of here. See you guys.